morning, everyone. Or maybe I should say good afternoon. It's just afternoon. And my name is Frank Schwartz. I'm Executive Director of CCEPA, the Canadian Centre for Ethics and Public Affairs. And we are a joint venture of St. Mary's University and Atlantic School of Theology. And we put on programs like this regularly, and are delighted to see you and hope you will continue to come to our further programs. We are gathered here to hear Blair Feltmate talk about sustainable development, an investment or a cost. So I wanted to quickly introduce Blair, but before I do, I wanted to remark that you have at your place our evaluation forms, which we'd like you to consider right now, and I'll mention them at the closing. They're very, very important to us. We actually do use your feedback for speakers, and in fact some of the feedback indicated that our introductions and closings should be shorter, so I'm going to be fairly short, or not long-winded. So in any case, I'd love to introduce Blair, who's an engaging gentleman. It's Dr. Blair Feltmate. Blair is Director of Sustainable Development for Ontario Power Generation. Previously, he was Vice President of Sustainable Development with the Bank of Montreal, and prior to that, he spent 12 years developing the sustainable development programs for a number of multinational corporations, and he still looks like he's about 28 years old, so there's some magic there. Blair has been Sustainable Development Advisor to the American Chemistry Council in Washington, Office of the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development in Ottawa, and sits on a number of academic boards, as well as an editorial board that I'll mention in closing. He's the author of a number of books and numerous articles. If I would read the list to you, it would probably take all of our lunch hour. And he focuses primarily on environmental science and the business case for corporate sustainable development, which is obviously the reason we have here. He holds a number of degrees, a PhD in theoretical and applied ecology from, so we say in here, Blair, we say University of Upper Canada, the University of Toronto, that is, a number of 2 master's degrees and, of course, a bachelor's degree. And I'm absolutely delighted to pass Blair over to you. Blair Feltmate.
Thank you very much, and I'm certainly pleased to be here at noon to deliver this presentation, Sustainable Development, an Investment or a Cost. And before turning to the talk, again, I'd like to thank Frank and both Chris for having me here today and doing so much work to make this event happen. And I also love being in Nova Scotia. Although I was born and raised in Toronto, I spent my summers growing up here. My mother was born and raised just outside of Antigonish in a little place called Country Harbour, if anybody happens to know where that is. And my father is from Goshen, again just outside of Antigonish. My dad had 7 brothers, and my mother had 16 brothers and sisters. So I have an awful lot of relatives scattered all around Nova Scotia. And in the years before, our 2000 housing, I pretty much have an idea of what my grandparents were doing to keep warm at night. So, having said that, we'll now turn to sustainable development, an investment or a cost. And in reference to this title, we're going to focus on 4 objectives. First, we're going to define sustainable development. What does the term mean and where did it come from? Secondly, we're going to identify which industry sectors are embracing sustainable development. Third, we're going to profile the business case for sustainable development. And finally, we'll focus on profiling emerging sustainable development business drivers. In reference to the first question, defining sustainable development, I'm going to define it in 2 slides. The first definition will function at about the 60,000 foot level, and then we'll bring it down to maybe 25,000 feet. So the internationally recognized definition of sustainable development, and the one that many of you would be familiar with, it is defined as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And of course, this is the definition of sustainable development formulated by a body called the World Commission on Environment and Development in its 1987 release of a document entitled Our Common Future, or as that document tends to be more commonly referred to, the Brundtland Commission report, because the person who chaired this commission was Madame Brundtland, who at this time was the Prime Minister of Norway, and then she went on from that position to be the director of the World Health Organization. You would have seen her name in the news quite a bit during the tsunami disaster, for example. She's also a medical doctor, a very talented individual. Now, for corporations that are committed to sustainable development or committing to sustainable development that subscribe to this definition, it still tends to be a little bit nebulous for them in reference to operationalizing sustainable development. So to bring it down from the, as I say, the 60,000 foot mark to the 25,000 foot mark, in brief form, for corporations or indeed any entity, it could be a university, a church, or any organization, for organizations that are committed to sustainable development, they're committed to working in such a way as to minimize the environmental footprint of their operations while simultaneously working to bring value add to the communities in which they operate from both an economic and a social perspective. So companies that are committed to sustainable development are committed to best practices in all three of these areas, looking at that commitment functioning as an integrated whole. Sometimes people tend to use the word sustainable development. They treat it as a synonym for, or they use it interchangeably for the word environment, and that's wrong. By definition, sustainable development is more encompassing than its environmental antecedent. So when we're talking about sustainable development, we're talking about best practices in all three of these areas. Now, what might those practices look like? Here I've just put a few bulleted points to illustrate some of the best practices that might fit under each of the headings of environmental, economic, and social stewardship. For example, on the environmental dimension of sustainable development, companies may work to increase their overall recycling efforts. They may work to produce less waste per unit of productivity, which parenthetically is good both for the environment and for the bottom line of the business. For example, producing less waste per unit of productivity from an environmental perspective probably means that you're drawing down fewer resources from the natural world and subsequently sending less material off into landfills, which in many localities, particularly in North America, are in limited supply. From a financial perspective, it probably means that you're paying less to have material come into the front door of the organization and subsequently paying less to have the material shipped off into a landfill. You know, waste from a business perspective is effectively something you paid for that you haven't used, so producing less of it per unit of productivity is good from a bottom line perspective. Good stewardship in this area is a win-win situation both environmentally and financially, and that presages points that I'm going to develop more so further on in the talk. Other activities that companies may engage would include, for example, supporting energy efficiency programs. They will work in a variety of ways to reduce their spills. They may lower their SOx, NOx, greenhouse gas emissions. They may have commitments to enhance biodiversity in the localities in which they operate. In the case of Ontario Power Generation, and by the way, this isn't a talk on Ontario Power Generation, but in the case of the company I work for, if you produce nuclear waste, hopefully you manage it well. Companies may be ISO 14001 certified, and if you're not familiar with the term ISO 14001, it refers to an internationally recognized environmental management system that is audited. If companies are ISO 14001 certified, it means they have an environmental management system in place that has been verified. That is now changing, or ISO 14001 will continue to exist, but in the 2009-2010 timeframe, we'll be switching to ISO 26000, the focus of which is sustainable development. That will be a guideline. It won't be an audited program that companies embrace, ISO 26000, but the focus will be on sustainable development. In the economic dimension of sustainable development, companies will work in a variety of ways to help ensure that they're bringing value add to the communities in which they operate, wherever the companies may operate throughout the world. How might they want to be welcome corporate citizens in those economies. How might they do so in those localities? They may, for example, support local procurement efforts, purchase product locally wherever possible to put dollars or whatever form of revenue is appropriate in the country in which you're operating into the hands of the local people so they derive benefit from the operation. They may support local hiring efforts, i.e. instead of just shipping in their own people into a locality, they'll take local people, train them, bring them in as part of the business enterprise, again, so those people can derive benefit from the local operations. They may support training and scholarship programs. The benefits thereof are obvious. In the social dimension of sustainable development, Companies want to ensure that from the point of first contact in a community, that they operate with a strong sense of cultural sensitivity. So in particular, if you're a company that's, say, headquartered in the so-called first world or developed world, and you're looking at developing operations in the developing world, you want to make sure that from point of first contact that you don't start to impose all kinds of Western or first world standards on how people should conduct their activities in those localities in the world, which that prescription may not be well received by those local people. It'll create a degree of animosity between the company and the local peoples that at the end of the day won't serve anybody's interests very well. So cultural sensitivity is high on the agenda within the social dimension of sustainable development. More proximally, in terms of activities that may be engaged, companies may support door-to-door community outreach efforts, i.e. actually going into a community, knocking on doors. These are representatives from the company saying, this is who we are as a company, this is what we're doing, this is where we're heading, what questions might you have about our operations or concerns, etc. It's to put a face on a company rather than it being just a large structure behind barbed wire somewhere. Companies may support plant tours. Where plant tours aren't possible in the aftermath of 9/11, companies may establish community information centers. Other initiatives may be within the social dimension. Companies may support work and family life balance programs through, for example, flexible work hours to accommodate a diverse workforce. And indeed, more and more companies are recognizing the value of diversity in the workforce and putting programs in place to ensure that workforces, which increasingly so are comprised of people now from all over the world, different cultural backgrounds, racial backgrounds, religiosities, sexual orientation, and so forth, you want to make sure that you have a workforce such that there aren't ceilings limiting people's rise through the workforce based on some aspect of differing cultural or racial or whatever backgrounds. So flying at 35,000, or I guess it said 25,000 feet, that's what sustainable development looks like with a snapshot. Now, very often people look at this and they'll think, is this sort of just window dressing or greenwash or whatever? Are companies really embracing these activities? Is this real on-the-ground stuff? And I can tell you that for the average company that's meaningfully committed to sustainable development, that's on the leading edge curve here, it's not difficult at all to go into a company and identify anywhere from maybe 60 to 200 or 250 tangible, measurable, verifiable programs along the lines of these bulleted points that companies are engaging to turn this stuff into reality. And I can tell you for sure, I've been on the inside of multitudes and multitudes of companies to evaluate their performance in the area of sustainable development, particularly back when I was running a sustainable development-based pension fund for the Bank of Montreal. We used a measure of the sustainable development performance of companies to determine the inclusion of companies in the portfolio we managed. So I had to go in and investigate these companies on the ground, and in the vast majority of cases, what they say they're doing, they're actually doing. So it's real stuff. Now, 10, 15 years ago, that wasn't always the case. For example, and it's good doing this on the East Coast versus the West Coast, because for the example I'm going to illustrate, this is a safer place to be. Back in about 1995 or 1996, McMillan Bloedel, a large forestry company, many of you will remember, now owned by Weyerhaeuser, back then, they were involved in a program whereby they were cutting trees from old-growth forests. These were trees anywhere from 500 to 2,500 years old. And there were a lot of people in the environmental community that objected to that. They thought, for lack of a better descriptor, it was less than prudent, if not stupid, to be cutting down trees that were so old. There was a lot of animosity in the air and rancor going back and forth between McMillan Bloedel and the environmentalist community. Nonetheless, that year in 1996, McMillan Bloedel came out with a sustainable development report that looked better than the Sears Roebuck catalog. They showed moose feeding in swamps and eagles soaring over mountaintops, etc., and the world just looked like a wonderful place, with virtually no mention of the issue pertaining to Clayoquot Sound. That's the locality in which they were cutting the trees down from the old-growth forest. The company got absolutely lambasted in the media and the Report on Business section in the Globe and Mail, etc., for not having full disclosure, for lack of a better descriptor, in reference to their practices in the area of Clayoquot Sound. In response, McMillan Bloedel came out with a sustainable development report in the subsequent year that they almost responded too far the other way. It looked like it was printed on dirty toilet paper. They went too far to downgrade everything they were doing in the area of sustainable development, which wasn't prudent either. But through that example and other examples of where companies might have been, fractionally exaggerating their commitment to sustainable development, presidents, CEOs, boards of directors, management of companies, and so forth realize that whatever we say we're doing, it better withstand scrutiny when people come and shine the flashlight into the corners, because they will. Between American Rivers, Trout Unlimited, Greenpeace, Sierra Club, etc., your performance will be scrutinized. And in terms of your performance for companies, you have to make sure that you have full disclosure. You talk about the good with the bad, warts and all. So it's not just the good news stories. You talk about fines, exceedances, the deaths of contract workers, employees, missed targets, etc. It's full disclosure. So point number one is this is real stuff. Number two, when companies say they're doing it. Number two, you look at this and you think, well, this probably only applies to companies in the resources sector, i.e. mining, forestry, petroleum, utilities, and perhaps manufacturing. And that's the way it was in Canada up to about 1996, 1997, maybe 1998. But since that time, the term sustainable development has promulgated itself quite well and infiltrated the boardrooms of companies across all industry sectors. So now we see IBM is very much on the sustainable development pathway. We have Hewlett-Packard very much on the sustainable development pathway. Four Seasons Hotels, very much on the, in their subsequent companies, very much on the sustainable development pathway. Certainly the major banks now, many of them are on the sustainable development pathway, and in particular in Canada, the Royal Bank, Bank of Montreal, and the Bank of Nova Scotia in particular. So companies across all industry sectors are embracing sustainable development. Then you think, well, in the environmental dimension of sustainable development, this really doesn't apply to, say, a bank, but you take something like the Royal Bank of Canada. Royal Bank has more or less 66,000 employees and 1,600 branches across the country. They've embraced programs such that in reference to the real estate they own or that which they lease, they either have or are retrofitting to have energy efficient lighting throughout all of their real estate. Low flow faucets, low flow toilets, low flow fountains. Carpeting is such that, and no slight against the Delta, but they wouldn't buy this carpet. You couldn't purchase this carpet today at the Royal Bank. They will only buy carpet that comes in small square tiles, of which you can take the worn area and replace it. The areas that are removed are sent for 100% recycling through an agreement they have with a company called Interface Flooring, which in and of itself is a company well committed to sustainable development. They have mandates in place that their photographic equipment, computer monitors, printers, etc., have to have a high Energy Star level rating in place. Across all paper that they use in the bank has to be labeled as Forest Stewardship Council certified, which means it was produced through sustainable forestry practices. Across their 1,600 branches, they've almost completely eliminated the use of insecticides, herbicides, and road salt, or very much limited its application of road salt, to limit their impacts to surface and groundwater pollution. And the list goes on. If you add all those initiatives up and what the potential environmental footprint would be based on 66,000 employees, it would be huge. But they've embraced these programs to limit that footprint. So the second point, the first point here is that this is real stuff, applicable across all industry sectors, and applicable across all industry sectors. So that's that. Now, just to show you that I'm not making all this stuff up, what we have now in Canada on an annual basis, we have about 120 to 130 companies currently producing sustainable development reports each year. Internationally, we have at the moment between 2,000 and 2,500 companies producing sustainable development reports each year. I'm just curious, with a show of hands, how many people have read corporate sustainable development reports? So quite a few. Good. These reports, for those who haven't seen them, they look like annual reports. They're maybe 25 to 65 pages in length, only they focus on sections on environmental, economic, social best practices, and they're chock full of performance metrics in each one of those areas, covering each of those areas. And across the top line here, you see examples of companies that you would probably expect to be producing sustainable development reports or concerned with sustainable development. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, any of these companies are perfect practitioners. They're somewhere on the pathway of further engaging and operationalizing sustainable development performance. What we have, for example, in the top left, this is Alcan's Sustainable Development Report. They came very much on board to sustainable development, particularly when they were led by Travis Engen, who was president and CEO up to not too long ago. Rio Tinto's Sustainable Development Report. Now, and these are there by design, side by side, as you know, Rio Tinto has acquired Alcan, and it's Rio Tinto Alcan. And indeed, in the full-page advertisements that the Rio Tinto and Alcan took out on the back page of the Globe and Mail report on business section to sell that acquisition or win shareholders over. In their dissertation as to the compatibility of the companies, about 25% of that dissertation focused on their compatibility based on their common commitment to sustainable development. Canfor, Canadian Forestry Company, their Sustainable Development Report, they came very much on board to sustainable development when they used to be run by David Emerson, now the Minister of, I think he's International Trade. Might be wrong about that. He tends to jump around, not just within a, but anyhow, it doesn't matter. But he used to effectively salivate talking about the merits of sustainable development, and he had to, because Canfor was a major supplier of wood product, lumber, to Home Depot. Home Depot in and of itself became focused very much on embracing sustainable development, because back in the around 1996, 1997, they were selling lumber from trees that were born of old growth forests, a little bit like the description earlier on when I talked about Clockwood Sound. And more so in the U.S. than in Canada, people in the environmental community objected to that, and Home Depot had protesters out front of their stores and boycotts being implemented in reference to their lumber sales based on the fact that their lumber was derived from trees from old growth forests. Home Depot didn't like that, and they subsequently embraced programs that recognize that thereafter all lumber they sell has to be Forest Stewardship Council certified, and then they went much further than that to fully embrace sustainable development and bring it into their business operations. And indeed, when they committed to sustainable development, it even influenced their competitors. When Home Depot says something is important, by definition it becomes important. 25% of all lumber sales in North America right now come through Home Depot. Home Depot opens a new store somewhere in the world right now every 47 hours. So when they say it's important, it becomes important, and they've influenced Lowe's to come on board to sustainable development best practices. But back to their supplier, Canfor, they better get religion in the area of sustainable development, or they wouldn't have been doing business with Home Depot. We see Shell Canada's Sustainable Development Report. They came on board early on about 1993 when they were run by Jack McLeod, who very much understood the merits of sustainable development performance. And fortunately, Jack died not too long ago. Suncor Energy, their Sustainable Development Report, and they certainly have their challenges based on the fact that their heavy involvement in the tar sands, and again, they're in the Globe and Mail this morning, talk about aspects of sustainable development performance. Rick George, who runs Suncor, understands these issues very well. They've put about $130 million now into a renewable energy portfolio. So as a complement to what they're doing in their work in the tar sands, they're also very much involved in the area of renewable energy. Now, on the lower line, we see a few companies that you might not think so much would be practitioners in the area of sustainable development. We have, for example, Coca-Cola's Sustainable Development Report. And this is Big Coke out of Atlanta, Georgia, World Operations. Ryco, I never know how to say that, but the makers of photocopier equipment, their Sustainable Development Report. In the pharmaceutical sector, we have Baxter's Sustainable Development Report, but we could have easily put here Merck Frost or AstraZeneca or Bayer. In the hospitality sector, Razador, the second or third largest hotel owner in the world, their Sustainable Development Report. In the cosmetics area, L'Oreal's Sustainable Development Report. In the banking sector, the Royal Bank Sustainable Development Report. So companies across all industry sectors are embracing sustainable development. And just to beat the point to death, what you're looking at on this slide, and it could be bigger now with more logos, are the logos of companies that have made a formal commitment to sustainable development. They're somewhere on the path of embracing and operationalizing sustainable development. You'll see now, so that is not to say any of them are perfect practitioners in the area, but they've made a formal commitment to sustainable development. And given that I'm from Ontario Power Generation, I should probably take Ontario Power Generation's logo here and put it up here where Pfizer is, the makers of Viagra. And to be honest, I used to have a really good joke about the president of OPG and Viagra, but it doesn't go over well. It's considered in poor taste, so I don't tell anymore. But anyhow, and he kind of heard about it and discouraged me from telling it. So the point is, lots of companies across lots of industry sectors are embracing sustainable development. Now, let me go up for a second. Now the question is, why? Why are companies embracing sustainable development? We know what it is, we know where the term came from, and we know who's doing it. Why are they doing it? The bottom line is this. For 97% of the reason companies practice sustainable development, it comes down to one reason only. is to have a positive impact on the bottom line and ultimately share price performance, and that's it. Every company I know of that's practicing sustainable development, with one or two exceptions, they would drop it overnight if they didn't think the business case for sustainable development was there. Now, having said that, that's not to say that the people that run corporations and industry and so forth, they're not egregious, nefarious individuals. I have yet to meet anybody in the senior management of corporations or boards of directors who didn't also appreciate the fact that sustainable development is the right thing to do. They all have kids and grandchildren and so forth, and they want the world to be a better place. But I can tell you, after having been on the insides of innumerable companies and in front of lots of boards of directors and senior management, to sell sustainable development, you better sell them on the business case up front. It has to be there. Now, what is the business case? And indeed, why should people in the investment community pay attention to the sustainable development performance of companies? At the end of the day, sustainable development, properly applied, has a positive impact on the bottom line. And there are about 10 or 12 categories of reasons as to why sustainable development is good for business when properly applied. And usually it comes down to about three, and that have varying degrees of applicability depending on the industry sector you're looking at. And it usually comes down to 2 or 3 factors that are the main drivers as to why a company in a particular industry sector would embrace sustainable development. On the left-hand side of the slide here, I'm going to talk about some of the causal reasons as to why sustainable development is good for business. And then on the right-hand side, I'm going to briefly discuss how the companies that are practitioners of sustainable development, how that functions as a proxy for identifying companies that have superior quality of management and for reasons independent of sustainable development are companies that you would want to invest in. And these are in no particular order also. Causal reasons why sustainable development is good for business. Number 1, to gain access to markets or to receive a mandate for new build. For example, let's say you're a mining company. Let's say you're the old Falconbridge, now it's Xstrata. And you decide you want to open a new mine in northern Ontario or Voisey's Bay or Wisconsin, Venezuela, Papua New Guinea. It really doesn't matter where you're going to go in the world. Today, you better be able to walk into that locality with a substantial sustainable development / environmental stewardship track record under your arm. And if you do not have that, the probability of you gaining licensing to open that new facility is very much limited. Countries around the world and the peoples in those localities where an operation may be started, they don't want somebody coming in who doesn't care about the environment, doesn't care about the local economy, or gives credence to best practices in any of those areas. And indeed, if you go to a locality in the world where people aren't worried about that stuff, the red flags go up immediately to say, is this the kind of country we want to build a couple of $100 million of infrastructure in? So when I started out in 1991 or 2 or whatever it was, working with multinational corporations to operationalize sustainable development, I mostly did so with companies in the mining sector. It was Falconbridge, Noranda, Rio Elcom, Barrick Gold, Placer Dome, Freeport McMoran, and others. This was their primary reason to get on the sustainable development pathway. If they didn't open a new mine. Employee attraction and retention and productivity. There's been very good studies come out in the last 2 years now from both Mercer's management and Towers Perrin, both large management consulting companies many of you be familiar with, where they've shown quantitatively, and they didn't call them sustainable development companies, but they called them environmental and social best practices companies, that in companies that were top-tier practitioners environmentally and in terms of social best practices, all else being equal, they had they were more attractive to potential new hires than companies that weren't good at this stuff. The turnover of employees in companies from companies that were good environmentally and socially was much lower than in companies that weren't good environmentally and socially. And turnover in companies is enormously expensive. Very often it takes 1 to 2 years from a new hire just to get a return, to start to get a return on investment out of them. So you want to keep turnover low. And then by a variety of measures, they showed that the productivity of employees in companies that were good environmental and social best practices companies, it was higher in those companies as opposed to companies that weren't good at this stuff. So for a bunch of reasons, from that perspective, you want to be on the sustainable development pathway. A discount on borrowed capital and lower insurance premiums. The banks actually recognize now, or many banks, that companies that are good at sustainable development represent less risk. The probability of them defaulting on a loan is lower if they're good at sustainable development than if they aren't good at sustainable development. And indeed, when I worked at Noranda, many of you know Noranda, the mining company, Canadian-based mining company, Noranda's primary banker was the Royal Bank. The Royal Bank recognized that Noranda was a leading-edge practitioner in the area of sustainable development, and the probability of something going wrong in their operations, a tailings wall collapsing somewhere, was much lower than other mining companies that weren't good at sustainable development. And the Royal Bank actually shaved basis points off the cost of borrowed capital when they were lending money to Noranda. And indeed, the banks now will scrutinize the sustainable development / environmental performance of companies such that you may not even get a loan if you're not good in reference to performance in this area. And exactly the same thing applies to insurance companies. Insurance companies recognize that companies that are good at sustainable development represent less risk for the reasons I just mentioned, and they'll actually give risk-adjusted insurance premiums to companies that are ahead of the curve in this area. And AIG is the leading practitioner in the insurance industry in reference to that point. Addressing customer demands, I've already mentioned an example of this in regards to Home Depot, and you can think of your own examples. Facilitating partnerships. If you're not good at this stuff, companies won't want to do business with you, or conversely, you won't want to do business with them if they're not good at sustainable development, because those companies bring a liability to the table. Increasing the efficiency, sustainable development can function as a driver for increasing the efficiency of operations. It facilitates thinking in this area. So companies will work to produce less waste per unit of productivity, to consume less electricity per unit of productivity, to consume less water per unit of productivity, etc. All of which is good for the bottom line. And finally, at least on this list, companies will work to ensure that they're included in sustainable development-based mutual funds and pension funds. More and more, and I'm going to expand on this point later on, you'll see that the investment community, both retail and institutional, is taking, managers in those areas are taking into account the sustainable development performance of companies. If you want your company included in terms of an investment vehicle in those funds, you want to be working ahead of the curve on sustainable development. And I'll expand on that point later on. Now, independent of all those reasons, and from the perspective of the capital markets, there is an additional reason you would want to invest in sustainable development companies, and it's this. And I presented sustainable development funds to probably 350 treasurers or managers of funds within companies and organizations across Canada, from Halifax to Victoria. And I noticed that when I was explaining the merits of sustainable development investing to them, and very often people in the financial community were hearing a lot of this stuff for the first time, they got the reasons that I just went through. That made sense to them. But what they really bought into was this. So hence we emphasize that point in presentations to them. By definition, companies that are committed to sustainable development think long-term and ahead of the curve. And if they're smart enough to think long-term and ahead of the curve in reference to embracing sustainable development, those companies are probably also thinking long-term and ahead of the curve in reference to all kinds of decision-making that's simply good for business, because by definition, these companies are run by smart people. So if you can quantitatively identify a company that's a top-tier practitioner in the area of sustainable development, which can be done, I'm going to show you the next slide, you've effectively developed an objective proxy for identifying companies that have superior quality of management, that are probably making good decisions in a whole bunch of areas that, independent of sustainable development, have a positive impact on the bottom line. So they're probably good in reference to issues pertaining to corporate governance, product innovation, financing options, manufacturing processes, production line efficiency upgrades, skills upgrades, continuous improvement for aspects of their company's operations, etc. The companies are probably good in all those areas as well. So in combination, by investing in these companies, you get the benefits of the direct bottom line causal factors that enhance shareholder value, in combination with those the benefits realized through superior quality of management. And I notice in traveling around the country talking to portfolio managers, mutual and pension fund managers, very often I'd ask them, what's the single most important thing you look at in reference to identifying a good company to invest in? And 9 times out of 10, they would come back with superior quality of management. And I'd ask them, well, how do you measure that? How do you get to that? And very quickly their answer would drizzle out. They say, well, we read their annual report. It seemed pretty good. We played golf with the guys. They seemed nice. We walked through their office. A lot of employees seemed to be smiling. They didn't really have a good quantitative way to get at quality of management, and they liked this approach. Now, assuming that everything I've said in reference to sustainable development being good for business makes sense, it stands to reason that if we could create a portfolio of companies that are top-tier practitioners of sustainable development and track the share price appreciation of that portfolio over time and compare it to the appropriate market benchmark, i.e. a portfolio of companies that were the same in all regards but that weren't top-tier practitioners in sustainable development, we'd assume the sustainable development portfolio may outperform the non-sustainable development portfolio. And that's where I'm going next. What you're looking at here is a diagrammatic representation of a way to measure the sustainable development performance of companies. And very quick, it's called the Sustainable Development Index. This is the system we used at the Bank of Montreal. The actual index is pages and pages in length, but you'll get the idea here. On the left-hand side of this matrix, we have the three categories of sustainable development performance: environment, economy, and society, and then a general catch-all category where proxies or factors that are important to measuring the sustainable development performance of companies belongs, but it doesn't actually fit under the other categories, so we put it in a general category. Then in the central column, level 2 metrics, we have a whole series of measures that fall under each of those categories that when you go into a company, you focus on those measures and quantify performance. And on the right-hand side of the matrix, you can actually score performance on a scale of 0 to 5, 5 being the best score, 0 being the worst. And based on a combination of conducting site visits, presenting the companies with questionnaires, interviews with both people within the company and in the community in which the company operates, and reviewing corporate sustainable development and environmental reports, you can get a pretty good handle on performance and document performance quantitatively for each of the measures at hand. And by the way, the index is idiosyncratic as per industry sector, i.e. the measures you use to measure the sustainable development performance of a bank are different than the assemblage you use for a mining company, let's say, for obvious reasons. And there are weightings attached to these measures and so forth. The details don't matter. But at the end of the day, when you get the matrix filled out, using a simple weighted mean algorithm, you can convert score to a percent. And in the case of the funds we were managing, we determined that any company that scored 70% or higher using this system, we identified as a meaningful practitioner of sustainable development, eligible for inclusion in the funds that we manage. So we weren't saying you had to be a perfect practitioner. We were saying you had to be pretty good at sustainable development, and by pretty good, we meant 70% or higher. Now, using a system very similar to this, we can look at some outcome on performance here. What you're looking at is something called the Dow Jones Sustainability World Index. How many people are familiar with the Dow Jones Sustainability Index? So, okay, maybe about 10 or something like that. What happened is Dow Jones, that everybody's heard of, working with a group in Western Europe called Sustainable Asset Management. Actually, they started working together back in 1993. Sustainable Asset Management developed a means to measure the sustainable development performance of companies that's not dissimilar to that which I just showed you. And then, using that system, they created a sustainable development portfolio of companies and tracked the share price appreciation of that portfolio over time. And the index was a combination of back testing and forward testing, and the forward testing started in August 1999. And you can see the share price performance of the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. It is represented by the green line. And in reference to total returns over date, it's up 14.18%. As compared to its market benchmark of the Morgan Stanley Capital Index with total returns of 11%. So you can see the Sustainable Development Index portfolio of companies is outperforming the non-sustainable development portfolio. And for people that work in the capital markets, you can see that anything that gives you an alpha, anything that's above a benchmark, you're happy with. And to be up several percent is pretty good. And by the way, this is a pretty good apples-to-apples comparison in the sense that they didn't just load up the sustainable development portfolio or index with a whole bunch of banks and gold mining stocks that happen to do well during this period of time. These two lines are balanced for industry sector representation. So at any point in time, if banks comprise 6% of the weighting of one portfolio, they comprise 6% of the weighting of the alternate portfolio, of the Morgan Stanley portfolio. And also the companies in both portfolios are equivalent, or roughly equivalent, in terms of market capitalization, i.e. companies in both portfolios have a market capitalization of $1 billion and up. In the Sustainable Development portfolio, it's reflective of companies that span 33 countries. There are 318 companies in the portfolio representing 57 industry sectors. In reference to banks and institution houses around the world that have adopted or embraced the Dow Jones Sustainability Index in reference to managing sustainable development funds, in total that represents around the world a little over $5 billion in total investment vehicles. And I could also show you returns of other funds or indices similar to these, the Jansi Index in Canada, the KLD Index in the US, and they're all such that the Sustainable Development portfolio tends to run about 1 to 3% ahead of the non-sustainable development benchmark. Now, I want to make an additional point. Very often, I notice that people tend to think that sustainable development performance is kind of non-financial performance that's not predisposed to quantification regarding impact on share price. And that's not quite true. In this document, it's called I'll read it because you probably can't read the back, but it's called the SD effect, Translating Sustainable Development into Financial Valuation Measures. In this document, what was done is that the people involved in writing it, they performed an analysis such that they looked at the sustainable development performance metrics of 6 mining companies, real metrics, and the metrics taken from the sustainable development reports of the 6 mining companies. And there were Teck-Cameco, Falconbridge, Noranda, Placer Dome, Inco, and Alcan. And looking at those sustainable development metrics, what was done was there was an application of financial analysis tools, ratio analysis, discounted cash flow, rules of thumb evaluations, EVA, and options pricing to convert those sustainable development measures of performance into financial valuation and ultimately impact on share price. So these financial valuation tools that right now there's hundreds of people in this city performing analyses and evaluations of companies using those techniques. What this study did was simply took existing financial valuation tools and applied them to a set of metrics to which normally they had never been applied. And the calculations were made, for example, as to what degree the impact that the recycling program embraced by Alcan, what impact did that have on share price? Of a $20 share price, what percent of that would be explained based on a recycling program? So it actually married up. It took standard tools applied to a set of metrics to which they had never been applied to show that sustainable development performance has a predisposition to financial valuation. And I encourage you to take a look at this report. If you type SD effect into Google, it'll show up instantly. In reference to the report, Don Reed, the president and CEO of Franklin Templeton Investments, he said, the report provides the first steps in using financial language to measure the impact of sustainable development on the bottom line. This report lays the foundation in linking sustainable development to company performance and provides another tool for financial professionals to use in their ongoing analysis. So for companies that don't believe that you can translate sustainable development into impact on share price, that's simply not true. Now, finishing off, what are some emerging sustainable development drivers, and why do I believe sustainable development is going to become more important from a business practices perspective than not? And I'm going to hit on 6 or 7 points, and they're really in no particular order except for the last point. So what's going to drive sustainable development and its operationalization within business going forward? Well, a few points. I'm going to reference the first is the UK Turnbull report. It mandated that it's the United Kingdom, as of 2000, it required that companies listed on the London Stock Exchange disclose all risk, and that included financial, environmental, social, and ethical risk. That may well translate to other stock markets, and indeed I asked Barbara Stymiest, who used to be president of the Toronto Stock Exchange, now she works for RBC, what her thoughts were on this. And she said, in her opinion, that companies listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange will be required to produce a sustainable development style report in the not too distant future. Mind you, that was 2 years ago. And but it will be forthcoming, and it will be forthcoming not just to the Toronto Stock Exchange, but other stock exchanges around the world. Changes in pension legislation. As of 2000, again, this was in the UK, the UK required that pension plans disclose the degree to which they factor the environmental, social, and ethical performance of companies into their investment decision making. So it's not saying that you have to take these factors into account, but it was saying that if you take those factors into account, you have to explain how they're taken into account. And subsequently, since then, there's been pension legislation changes reflective of this change in France, Germany, Belgium, Sweden, and Australia. It hasn't come to Canada yet. When Paul Martin was Prime Minister, he liked this idea very much, but Stéphane Tremblay, who at the time was a measure of the Bloc Québécois, came forward with a plan to make these changes, and it became problematic in reference to who the messenger was, so that slowed things, that pretty much stopped things. In reference to assets under management using sustainable development or socially responsible investing or sustainable development style type analysis, the assets are growing. In particular, in Canada, in 2004, there was $65 billion in total SRI assets under management. In 2006, just 2 years later, that number had grown to $504 billion. And this increase was due primarily to SRI mandates by several major pension funds, teachers, OMERS, Caisse de Depot, etc. They had taken aspects of sustainable development style performance of companies into account in reference to investment decision making. And that's growing. Canada's pension plan has, as of maybe a year and a half ago now or something like that, created the position of the manager for responsible investing. Canada Pension Plan now manages over $100 billion, which this morning in the Globe and Mail it was listed at $112 billion. It's important when the Canada Pension Plan recognizes that sustainable development style investment is consistent with fiduciary responsibility. And Don Raymond, who's the Senior Vice President of Investing and Equities Investing for the Canada Pension Plan, he's a big believer in this stuff. He, for lack of a better term, likes it a lot. I noticed traveling around the country that not just environmental programs, but in MBA programs, you see the inclusion of sustainable development style courses in MBA programs. For example, well, I'll just read the point. Most MBA programs now feature corporate sustainable development courses. And at the Ivey School of Business at the University of Western Ontario, it's no longer an option as to whether or not you're going to study corporate sustainable development to get your degree. To graduate from the Ivey School of Business with an MBA, you have to take a course in corporate sustainable development. It's a non-option. And I noticed myself, anecdotally, speaking to students at that university, I go there once a year usually, they'll bring three sets of classes together, about 80 students each time, where I'll talk about corporate sustainable development. And I noticed that one of the biggest problems I have is getting out of the class with all the questions they have. And it's not coming from, two people in the front row wearing plaid jackets. The questions are coming from students all over the audience. They all seem to be really embraced and engaged in embracing this issue and engaged in it. We have now guidance in reference to sustainable development reporting. We have the Global Reporting Initiative. It's a guideline for reporting on sustainable development best practices for corporations and how to write sustainable development reports. Complement it with the emerging ISO 26000 guidelines, which focus on sustainable development. We've effectively, as the point says, we have international standards have been developed to guide corporate sustainable development reporting. Standards are now in place for industry sectors. We actually have guidelines that are broken down for the electricity industry, for the mining industry, for the banking industry, etc. So the guidelines are now becoming industry specific. There is going to be a cost attached to carbon. Probably starting out, it's going to be somewhere in the vicinity of $15 to $30 per ton. It's going to drive corporate thinking in this area. Whether or not we ultimately see implemented a cap and trade system or a carbon tax like they've embraced most recently in British Columbia, and again, more announcements made on this in today's Globe and Mail. Whatever the ultimate form of manifestation of putting a price on carbon, it's coming, period. And companies have to factor that into capital cost allowance and investments and so forth. We have promulgators of this topic around the world. For example, Al Gore, everybody knows, talking about an inconvenient truth and winning a Nobel Prize and an Oscar and who knows what else he's won. James Lovelock, who in my opinion is the most advanced environmental scientist in the world today, thinking about this subject, promulgating his thoughts in his work on Gaia. I've actually just spoke to him recently to bring him from the UK over to Canada, so he's going to come next spring and give a talk, and he'll draw so much attention. We'll probably have it at Convocation Hall at U of T. It's the only place big enough to really accommodate the people who would want to hear from him. And the bottom one, the biggest driver, with no question about it, is going to be world population growth. We know right now we've got more or less about 6.6 billion people on the planet, and right now our situation is easy compared to what's coming. Through population momentum, growth, we're going to have for sure another 2.25 billion people on the planet by 2025, 2030. That's another 2.25 billion people we have to feed, house, clothe, educate, and so forth. We're going to have disparities, growing disparities between the haves and have-nots in the world, and that is going to be a major, major driver going forward. So if people think that this is a tough environment, this is pretty easy right now in the area of sustainable development. What's coming is going to be far more challenging, which is kind of depressing way to end. But anyhow, in reference to conclusions, what can we conclude? An environmental focus for corporations is effectively out of date. Sustainable development is the new business imperative regardless of industry sector. So if your company is focusing on the environment, you're out of date. The new game is sustainable development. Sustainable development is a long-term trend. It's not a fad. It's here to stay, period, based on all the factors that will drive sustainable development going forward that I've described. And ultimately, in reference to the title of the talk, sustainable development properly applied is a revenue generator. It's a value driver. It's not a cost, and it correlates with quality of management. And I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Sure. We have time for a couple of questions anyways.
Tamara's questions are going to be hard, so anyhow.
Well, a couple of comments. One is I'm the coordinator of the Education for Sustainable Development Working Group, trying to advance the United Nations Decade on Education for Sustainable Development. So if people are interested in the work that we're doing, we have a number of events coming up around sustainability education. Please come and see me. And Frank and I are also part of the Canadian Business Ethics Research Network, trying to advance business ethics research, especially in the Atlantic region. So if people are interested in that, to come and see me as well. I don't think we're doing enough around educating for sustainable development. And I think one of the things that's missing here, and I'd like you to just speak to that really quickly, is why the federal government is not one of the drivers of this. Why, for instance, in Canada, do we not have a national sustainable development strategy? The European countries do.
Well, it's funny. Through an amendment to the Auditor General's Act of 1995, it was mandated by law that the federal government of Canada had to actually develop plans and subsequently implement sustainable development best practices for its own operations. So all of the various departments and the 26 departments and agencies of the federal government of Canada develop plans in reference to operationalizing sustainable development within the Department of Defense, Agriculture, Public Works, etc. And the plans that were developed were pretty good. The problem was in reference to operationalizing those plans, it just really went nowhere. And one of the things I noticed was, because I sat in on these meetings and was an advisor to the Auditor General on this, that when you brought all the various departments, 26 agencies and departments of the federal government of Canada into one room in reference to talking about moving forward on sustainable development, the problem was without the Prime Minister in the room or the Deputy Prime Minister, nobody was in charge of the meeting. And it was just fundamentally flawed from the word go. What we tried to do, though, and when Brian Emmett was Canada's Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development, the commissioner that preceded Joanne Jelenas, who was fired not too long ago, with Brian Emmett, he recognized, he said, I'm hired here to audit the sustainable development performance of the departments and agencies of the federal government. I'm not here to write the mandate, or my mandate is to audit the degree to which it's happening, sustainable development within government. But he said, I don't mind influencing it. So what he did in his last two reports to Parliament, he put a table in the back of his report where across, it was a matrix, and across the top of the matrix he put all the different departments of the federal government. Down the side of the matrix, he put a list of environmental, economic, and social practices the departments and agencies were embracing in reference to operationalizing sustainable development. So you could quickly look down the columns and see which departments and agencies were doing a lot in this area and which weren't doing very much. And effectively what he did, he embarrassed the various ministers into getting their rear ends in gears to operationalize sustainable development. But it's still, you're quite correct, it's not receiving the attention it should. And for the government to mandate it of corporations, it has to operationalize it itself in its own operations. The Canadian government is the largest owner of land, the largest employer, etc. in the country, the largest real estate holder. If the government doesn't operationalize it, how can they expect everybody else to do it? It's not happening, and I have a sneaky feeling that as long as this Prime Minister is Prime Minister, I don't think it's going to go forward in a big way. I think you're going to see a change, though, even after the U.S. election. The U.S.'s policy on sustainable development, whether you have a Republican or a Democrat gets in the White House, within 35 minutes there's going to be a big change in how the U.S. views sustainable development, which I bet you will influence the Canadian government.
Gentleman over there.
Hi, I'm involved with Public Service Pension Plan in Nova Scotia. Just a question on, and so we're quite interested on the labour side anyway, socially responsible investment. Do you see that as the same thing? I mean, I know they're different terms, but is it synonymous or interchangeable with sustainable development? And I'm also, if I can ask a supplementary, that you presented, I think, a very interesting slide in terms of the legislation in the UK and other countries. And I wondered, I know you can't cover it in great detail, but what suggestions you might have about how that would work in terms of disclosing pension plans, their look at this whole area in their decision making.
Okay. For the first part, I see a distinction between socially responsible / ethical investing versus sustainable development investing. Sustainable development investing, properly applied, you're using it simply as a tool, one more tool in your arsenal to identify companies that make for good long-term investments. If, as an ancillary benefit, you appreciate the fact that, by the way, these companies are quote-unquote doing the right thing, that's the ancillary benefit. Ethical style investing tends to focus on the application of negative screens and the removal of complete industry sectors. So it's effectively saying we don't invest, through some combination of these, companies involved in alcohol, tobacco, nuclear, gambling, military, pornography, but it's the application of negative screening. So it's a values-based investing. I don't mean value from a financial value, I mean a personal values-based investing perspective, that it isn't wrong, but it will certainly, you have to recognize, compromise returns. Because if you have someone comes along and says, I think all petroleum companies and all mining companies, those two industry sectors are just evil or not ethical, and we're not going to invest them, you're going to give up returns. So it's not right or wrong, but they are two different styles of investing. And in reference to the second part of the question, in reference to disclosure, for public plans, most of them right now to date have adopted the Janssy tools. Michael Jancsy's, well, there's two in Canada, Michael Janssy and Innovest Strategic Value Advisors. Those are the two groups that on scale are performing analyses of the sustainable development, but also / environmental best practices of companies. They will disclose exactly how they're doing the evaluations, and also they'll put together segregated a product, so it's not pool products, so they can cater it to your specific investment needs with any pool of money that's bigger than more or less $25 million. And you can work with them to actually cater it to, this is our investment mandate, and consistent with fiduciary responsibility and reflective of the values of our investors. But you have to work with them pretty much one-on-one to do that.
Neil Livingston, Black River Hydro Limited, Margaret Environmental Association. A couple of things. The environmental focus is out of date. I have actually a fairly tremendous concern about that, because into Halifax about a year and a half ago came William McDonough, who I'm sure you know, and he gave a speech about really how that's the top focus. It really controls a lot of the drivers for sustainable development. And I think giving that message that environment focus is out of date is fairly dangerous. I mean, one of the questions I would ask from listening to your speeches is if sustainable development in the way that you're describing is the correct one, why has the country's emissions gone up for carbon, and why, for instance, if the big massive corporations have their head offices in Toronto, why does Toronto have such terrible air quality compared to a lot of other major cities around the world? Yeah. So there seems to me to be, within the risk of what you're describing, the ability for that sector which you're working in to be comfortable with their success, but in reality not be succeeding at all.
Right. In reference to Bill McDonough, I don't agree with. I don't disagree with anything he had to say. I think all business is a subsidiary of the ecosystem. If the ecosystem collapses, everything collapses around it. So everything is built on that. Everything is a subsidiary corporation of the ecosystem. So we have to maintain the integrity of the ecosystem. Within the context of that, I would say that we need to focus on environmental best practices, but as a complement to that, and beyond that, to also be inclusive of social and economic best practices for performance. So the way to think of it is everything is a subsidiary corporation of the ecosystem. Built upon that are aspects of environmental, economic, and social stewardship. You've got to maintain the whole structure. Right now what I see is there are still companies that are still thinking in the single dimension of the environment without expanding to social and economic performance. But all of that has to be based on living within ecological carrying capacity. So that's what I think.
I'm with the provincial utility regulator, and I'm just wondering your experience. I realize there are maybe jurisdictional issues or limitations, but what's your experience in terms of regulatory oversight on companies that have adopted sustainable development programs across Canada, across the industry sector?
It's sort of a mixed bag. It depends on the industry sector. Some sectors that really didn't perform very well early on, such as the pulp and paper industry, they're now highly regulated. Because for a long time, the discharges of pollutants downstream of pulp mills was such that they simply weren't stepping up to the plate to ensure that they limit their environmental impacts. And in not doing so, the legislation that was developed was such that at the end of the day, it ended up costing that industry sector more to adopt to the regulated changes that were mandated than had they embraced best practices on their own. And also the practices that were put in place by legislation, I believe, weren't as effective as what that particular industry sector could have done had it done so voluntarily. So having said that, I see other industry sectors now are learning from circumstances like that. For corporations, they're far better off to take the bull by the horns and get ahead of the curve on sustainable development and develop their own programs on a voluntary basis to embrace sustainable development. And if they don't do so well, you always have the threat of legislation on their backs. So you need the two factors working in combination. And I think right now, when you look at, in the last few days, everybody sees report in the Globe and Mail about the various companies working out in the tar sands, Suncor, Petro-Canada, and Shell, and two others I forget. They're looking at limiting new licensings for tar sands development, and it's a process of trying to implement a little bit of self-regulation because they can see if they don't start to do it themselves, government's going to do it for them in a very heavy-handed way. So I think you need the threat of legislation there, and if an industry sector doesn't do it for themselves, it's going to be done for them. And if it's done for them, A, it's probably going to cost them more, and B, it won't be as effective as what they could do on their own. And they've got to learn from that.
That type of regulation seems more focused on environmental versus economic and societal.
Yes, the focus disproportionately is environmental. And indeed, there's many aspects of sustainable development that I don't think you could actually develop legislation for. You're never going to develop legislation, I don't think, that's going to say that you're going to support a school lunch program in a community.
Just pay your taxes.
I would say probably, I mean, I haven't quantified this particularly, but it's something like 80% of the operationalization of sustainable development doesn't even have a predisposition to be legislated. Aspects of environmental performance, pertaining to SOx, NOx, mercury emissions, etc., that you can do. But there's a lot of community outrage about local hiring and so forth that would be very problematic. And also you have to remember, a lot of these companies I'm talking about, we're talking about best practices all around the world. It's not just for operations in Canada or in North America. For most companies that are leading edge practitioners, their commitment to sustainable development is such that the highest commitment that they have to sustainable development anywhere is the highest commitment that they have to sustainable development everywhere. The means by which that's operationalized in companies around the world will vary because very often there's just sometimes infrastructure doesn't exist to fully operationalize, say, a tire recycling program or a battery recycling program. But you can work with the local people to develop a system to recycle tires or batteries or whatever. The commitment of the company is still there. But an awful lot of this stuff I'm not sure it will ever have a predisposition to legislation. Oh, maybe one more?
I mean, a bit difficult in framing the question, but it relates. Energy is a good example. How do you tackle, well, let's create energy in a more sustainable way, so we'll stop burning coal, we'll do wind instead or something. But then there's the other issue of the overall total amount of energy that we're using. If we can reduce that, then that also helps to solve the problem. And it gets into, all the carbon issues, and then are you measuring percentage change, or are you measuring actual absolute total amount? When we have an economy that's so based on sort of growth and expansion all the time, how do we deal with the sort of let's shrink our energy industry? Do you have comments on that?
Overall, we're gluttons for energy use. There's no question about that. I'm not sure what the situation is in Nova Scotia, but in Ontario, we're looking at about a 10% reduction in total energy usage driven through conservation programs. So maybe taking 500 megawatts of demand out of the system. We're bringing into place more and more windmills and various forms of renewable energy, but at the end of the day, that at least in Ontario, I think will be about 400 megawatts of power or something like that. It's still pretty small relative to 30,000 megawatts of total demand on a hot day. And one that I think is going to be an uphill battle is going to be an increased transition to nuclear, moving away from fossil. And certainly in Ontario, by 2014, the mandate is to close all the fossil plants. I'm not sure it'll happen right on that date, but something about that time frame, it will occur. That'll take about 25% of energy production in Ontario out of capacity, but there's going to be expanded nuclear. There will probably be about 4,000 more megawatts of nuclear power brought to the system in the not too distant future. Nuclear power, it has its challenges as well, but one big one is it doesn't have greenhouse gas emissions, are virtually immeasurable compared to coal. And I'm speaking from a personal perspective now, not from an OPG perspective, but it just so happens they happen to coincide, and is that I agree with James Lovelock, and I agree with Madam Brundtland, I agree with Canada's chief scientist, Dave Schindler, that in the short term we have to use nuclear as a transition to get to where we want to go if we're going to lower greenhouse gas emissions today. Because right now we're functioning at about 380 parts per million equivalent of CO2 in the atmosphere versus 280 parts per million, which would be natural background. We're heading towards probably 420 parts per million equivalent or 450 parts per million equivalent CO2 in the atmosphere, and eventually we'll be at a point where it becomes a positive feedback system through methane releases in the Arctic such that you can't turn the system off. So the time to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is right now as fast as possible, period, using any means possible. And to my mind, that probably means greater dependence on nuclear, certainly in the short term.
Does it also mean massive conservation efforts so that we actually use less?
It does. It certainly does, and you need to do that, but it won't get you nearly as far as where you need to go, even if you have a totally successful conservation management program. I know when we had the blackout there a few years ago, it took 3 weeks later, everything went back to normal, and also I firmly believe people have to pay more for their power. At the end of the day, one thing, if you study the history of sustainable development, I've performed a fairly extensive study of it starting from about 1650 forward for North America. It wasn't called sustainable development, it was called preservation conservation practices. And if you read the works of all the leading thinkers on this subject and who have written about it over the years, George Perkins Marsh, who wrote the most insightful book ever on human-induced impacts on the environment, Man and Nature, in 1864, most insightful book to date. If you read George Perkins Marsh, Aldo Leopold, Gifford Pinchot, Paul B. Sears, John Muir, etc., if you read their works over their lifetimes, and their goal never changed. They wanted to promote preservation and conservation. But the arguments they made as they grew older became increasingly anthropocentric in nature, because they realized as they got older that people, corporations, and governments are motivated by arguments based on self-interest. Self-interest motivates. So we've got to appeal to self-interest, and self-interest is cost. And I think hoping people will do the right thing is nice, but as John Muir said, it shows good taste but poor insight. It's not going to get you where you want to go. And but I agree we should do all that, but we also will need more nuclear. Anyhow, I think I'm being cute here, so.
That's right. Anyhow, let me thank you on behalf of the whole group.
Thanks very much.
That was really excellent. We have a lovely token of our appreciation, but I won't embarrass our speaker by giving it to him now. It's on the it's on the table over there.
Great.
And I hope everyone enjoyed and was stimulated and provoked by the presentation. I just want to say a couple of things. One is the evaluation form. Please, I know I sound like a broken record, but I will continue to ask for your input. I wanted to say a couple of other things very quickly. There is outside a table with our the information about CCEPA and subsequent events, as well as a sign-up page, and we have a little page that tells you about the next 3 events. And in this series, the next one, following Blair, is Lunch with Toby Heaps. Toby is editor of Corporate Knights, which is kind of interesting Canadian magazine and movement. And also, I should add that Blair is on the editorial board of Corporate Knights. So this is a small but growing community and a very vital community that's worth hearing from. So we have Toby on April 24th. We have another person whose name you might have heard who's now become a real advocate of sustainable development, and that's Preston Manning, of all people. And Preston's going to be talking about actually more about re-engaging Canadians in the democratic process. And that's on May the 20th. On the 26th of May, we have Ed Freeman. He's a professor, one of North America's leading professors or academics on the issue of shareholders and stakeholders. So those are the next 3 programs, and they all carry some of the same themes that we're talking about here. Last but not least, please look at our website. We will have one of these. We'll have a DVD of this presentation along with all of our others, and this one will be out probably in about 4 weeks, so watch for it. Thank you very much for coming, and see you all next time.